Okay guys, update I guess number 12 on the TDI into an Mk1 swap. Couple things, obviously we got the core support, we'll talk about that in a second, but the first thing I want to do is talk about the intake and turbo piping. So on our, I guess what would be considered our charge pipe, right? Coming out of the turbocharger on the pressure side. The outlet's 1.5 inches, okay? Now, if I can get my cameraman to swing over here and we look down in here, I know it's dark, but if you look at the turbocharger, the outlet actually points straight down. Now, on our intercooler, it transitions to 2 inch. So we got to make the transition from 1.5 to 2 inch. Thought about doing it a couple different ways. Thought about, you know, getting an 1.75 inch piece of aluminum U-bend, putting it in there, welding it, trying to swell it on one end, shrink it on the other, grind it, metal finish it. Way too much work. Went on Amazon, found an 1.5 to 2 inch silicone coupler like these, but at a 45-degree angle. And if you look at the way our pipe is set up, I'll have to trim this back, but I left it long on purpose. We're gonna turn straight up, and our silicone 45 coupler that goes from 1.5 to 2 inch is gonna go right here. So that's basically gonna allow us to simplify a little bit, cut costs, and it'll be nice because this is kind of a tricky tube to fit in there if it were all one piece. If we have a coupler right here, it's just gonna make it a lot easier to put together. So there's that on the, we'll say the charge pipe. And for our intake, same solution. We've got to make a pretty tight transition on the intake side because I'd like to mount the air filter right up in here. So obviously we have our fuel filter mounted and our water separator. So that intake piping is going to come right through here, okay? Something I wanted to point out that I learned about the fuel filter, important. We talked about this return line, right, on the return on the pump, okay, that goes to the injectors, and there's a little check valve in here. Something interesting, I looked up on this fuel filter, this cartridge in here, okay, that cartridge is basically a return internal bypass, okay, and it is activated, let's say thermally, by temperature. And here's the reason why. With diesel fuel, when it gets cold, it wants to gel up. So when your TDI motor is cold, what the fuel filter does and the water separator with that cartridge in there, it makes the fuel recycle just right here between the engine and the cartridge. And what that allows it to do is heat the fuel up, okay? So the diesel flows a little better and it lubricates the pump. So I'm glad we went with the OEM stuff. I'm trying to keep this as integrated as possible. So it works good, it mounts right there, and the fact that it's gonna help drivability, that's definitely a really cool feature. So anyways, that's what's going on our turbocharger side, or intake side, I should say, with our intercooler. That's wrapped. Other things we took care of is obviously we said we got our coolant system all done and capped off. We're gonna see how well this works. I might move the location. This is for our gauge set, which I'm gonna show you in a minute. This is our sender for our water temp. Might move it towards the front of the block to get a more accurate reading. We'll check it with the temp gun versus the gauge, and we'll see how well that works. All our coolant lines are done. You can see that they're all connected now that we've got our radiator mounted. Obviously, we got our core support painted up. Looks pretty good. We've got a Napa out here in Ventura. They match the paint color pretty damn close. So that's nice. If you look on our intercooler down here, we're gonna swap out this hardware. It's just mock-up hardware for some flanged hardware. Same here. We're gonna run the same hardware all throughout this. They're M10s. But those are on rubber isolators to keep the radiator from cracking or anything like that, because you don't want the intercooler core to crack where it's welded to the tank. It can be a pretty common thing if your radiator is mounted way too rigid and it doesn't have any flex to it. So if you look up here all we did for our top mount is there's a bung welded to the top of the radiator tank. Now this grommet is just here, again, for mock-up purposes, but there's gonna be an aluminum plate that just goes like this, okay? It'll pass underneath here, it'll be tapped, and we'll have 2 more sets of hardware. So it'll just be super clean. The radiator will be totally trapped, isolated on rubber, the way it should be. Another thing, let's see, I'll turn the wheels here so we can take a look at the coilovers. What's up, Slicky? All right, so we're running those Solo Works coilovers. They went in super easy. One thing we overlooked is you're gonna wanna keep this top nut loose till you get the weight on the vehicle for the struts, so that nothing binds, okay? We want it kind of set to ride height. Now, initially they recommend like, I think 1 inch of preload in the spring. We had to go up. One of the reasons is, if you look on this TDI oil pan, it's pretty high capacity and it hangs down fairly low. So we obviously had to go up with the coils. Chase wanted to go lower, so did I. We might look at doing a fabricated pan, you know, in the future. But for now, we're gonna run a reasonable ride height. He just wants to drive it, take it on road trips, so we don't want the pan slamming on the ground. Now, going back to the gauges and the sending unit, we started mocking up our gauges for Chase's gauge set. These 3 gauges, they're gonna mount, you know, by the radio with your temperature controls and whatnot. And you can see I've got the other gauge panel just kind of sitting in there right now. Just for mock-up purposes, it's just resting there. I'll grab it once my cameraman gets the shot. So if you look at the way we arrange the gauge set, we basically have it in this arc, okay, with these gauges down lower instead of straight across, because the cabin is so compact. And with the stock wheel, let me go the other way. With the stock wheel, I wanted to make sure, you know, when Chase is driving it, he can see all his gauges perfectly. So basically with this opening like this, we ran the gauges in the same fashion. It's just gonna look more copacetic. Another thing we're gonna do is these aren't gonna stay bright aluminum. This is just for mock-up. They're in the raw. These are gonna get painted and wrinkle finish black to kind of match the textures in the cabin with the plastics and whatnot. So we want to make it blend. The gauges are obviously white faces, and you can modify the color. It's got LED control on it, so that's pretty sweet. But we still want to try to make it look as, you know, like it belonged there, more on the subtle side. Just some small tricks. I'm going to come in and clean this up with the jeweler's file. It was done on a plasma, not a laser. But we got our turn signal indicators. I'm going to pop a hole for the high beam indicator in the middle. It'll be all integrated into the stock harness. Everything will work like it was intended to. So between that gauge set getting mocked up and our sending units installed in the engine bay, we're really closing in on stuff. On the brake and clutch side, from the factory, the clutch was cable actuated, okay? So the cable from the clutch passed right through here. The problem is, if I've got the booster, obviously, and I know this isn't the right booster, guys, but still, it's close enough. Obviously, once this is in here, you've got an issue. Because this stock, or I shouldn't say stock, because the TDI transmission has a hydraulic clutch on it. I don't know what I do with that. Because the stock TDI transmission has a hydraulic clutch, it's in the back storage area. I bought a stock TDI master cylinder for the clutch, and there's multiple reasons for that. All of that stuff is engineered together. So depending on the size of the piston in the slave cylinder on the transmission, it will affect what type of master cylinder you run at the clutch pedal. So Volkswagen got it right from the factory. We don't want to mess with that. We're running two stock components. Now to connect them, obviously we need a hydraulic line. Couldn't find it at parts stores. When I went online and looked it up, they range anywhere from like 160 bucks to 200 bucks for an OEM component. Went online, I think I found a company called DPS. They specialize in Audi, Volkswagen stuff. I think it was 90 bucks, like 100 with shipping. Bought a stainless line that will connect to the factory style fittings. That'll do two things. One, saves us some money. Three things. Two, it cleans it up. And three, with the stainless braided line, it doesn't flex as much. So you get a lot more positive feel when you press the clutch. The line doesn't swell and expand like a factory one might. So we're gonna work that out. We're gonna run some type of offset up at the pedal assembly to mount the clutch master up in this vicinity and still have it actuated by a push rod. Once that's done, we can get our brake booster and master mounted, and then we'll get onto this. It might look bad, it might look intimidating, but we're gonna go through this. We're gonna use the Haynes manual. We're gonna go through the diagram. We're gonna clean up this harness, get it all integrated into the new components, and wrap it up, just make it look really clean. So that's kind of where we're at on this build. Once we get done with that stuff, we're gonna talk about how we're gonna mount the shifter, set that up, and then we're gonna get into some of the aesthetic stuff. We're gonna mount the headlights. We're gonna show you guys the grille design we have in CAD. But the main thing we wanna do now is get this thing fired up, get the gauges on it, and as soon as we get that computer from S&P, which should be any day now, I think we're gonna fire this up. Right, Slick? Alrighty guys, that's it. Stay tuned.